Like most consumer cameras, the Insta360 X3 is set up in such a way that you can just pick it up and take a good quality shot in the default settings. And that works very well in most cases. But if you really want to get the best out of this camera, you need to look a little deeper into the settings, especially if the shooting situation is not optimal. Today I'm going to show you what you need to pay attention to and what settings are optimal depending on the situation. But for that we better go back to the office, because there I can show you the settings a bit better.
Okay, before we even get into the capture settings, let's take a look at the different shooting modes and clarify which shooting mode is optimal in which situation. When you tap on the camera icon, the menu appears in which you can select the respective recording mode by swiping to the left and right. The selection depends on whether you are in 360 mode or single lens mode. As you probably know, your 360 camera has two separate lenses with two sensors. The camera then combines the images from both sensors into a single 360 image. If you choose single lens mode, the camera will only shoot with one of the two sensors and one of the two lenses. But why should you want to do that anyway? After all, the particular strength of this camera is the 360 mode with the ability to reframe the shot. There are mainly two reasons to shoot in single lens mode with the X3. Firstly, you don't have to reframe the shot and therefore save time in post. And secondly, especially if the lighting conditions are difficult and uneven, you may be able to get a better image quality with the single lens mode. This is mainly the case when one side of the camera is well exposed and the other is not. In single lens mode, the camera can optimally adjust exposure to one of the two sides. However, there is also a solution for this in 360 mode, but we'll get to that. In addition, in single lens mode, recordings in 4K are possible. A 360 recording that has been reframed, on the other hand, only has a resolution of 1080. Nevertheless, if the lighting conditions are even and good, there is hardly any difference in image quality between a single lens shot in 4K and a 360 shot. After all, it is the same sensor and the same lens. In this comparison shot, the 360 shot even contains a little more detail, for example here in the meadow. And then there is the Me mode. This not only saves you reframing, the camera also automatically keeps you in the center of the shot. This is ideal for all those who want to film themselves and then immediately share the recording via the smartphone without reframing. If this is not the case, however, I would not recommend it, because you can only edit the shot to a limited extent, and the image quality is not quite the same as in the other shooting modes. Apart from the cases mentioned, you should prefer the 360 mode with this camera. Only in this mode you can use the special strengths of the camera. In 360 mode, two shooting modes are of particular interest to us today. Of course, the standard video mode and the active HDR mode. If you want to capture a hyperlapse, you can use the time shift mode. However, you can also take a hyperlapse with the normal video mode and then simply speed up the shot in post. And if you want to take a time-lapse shot, I can recommend the interval mode. In this mode, individual photos are taken, which you later have to stitch together to a video. However, the overall image quality will be better than with the standard time-lapse mode. So when should you use the standard video mode and when should you use the active HDR mode? For consumer cameras of this size, shots in which there are very bright and very dark areas in the same image are a big challenge. The bright areas in the image often burn out and no details can be seen. And it is precisely for these situations that the active HDR mode is intended. It is supposed to help preserve details in the very bright areas of the image. But I would really only recommend this mode to you if you find yourself in exactly such a situation and want to achieve the best possible result. Because this mode also contains a whole series of disadvantages. It is absolutely not suitable for taking shots in low light conditions. The image will contain significantly more image noise than in normal video mode. And the active HDR mode also includes significantly fewer options in the capture settings than the standard video mode. And we will now look at these recording settings in detail in the standard video mode. The most important settings concern the resolution and the frame rate. Resolution and frame rate should be considered together, because the possible settings for the frame rates depend on the respective resolution. In the default settings, the camera shoots in 5.7K at 30 frames per second. 5.7K is the highest possible resolution on the X3, and you should only reduce this resolution in one case: if you want to shoot slow motion. In 5.7K you can choose between 30, 25 and 24 frames per second. There is a first basic rule you should follow. If you want to use your clip for a larger project, for example you want to use several clips for a larger video project, then you should ideally shoot all your clips in the frame rate in which you are creating your video project. So if you want to create a video project at 30 frames per second, then you should also shoot your clips at 30 frames per second. If you want to create your project at 25 frames per second, then you should also shoot your clips at 25 frames per second and so on. Generally, the more frames per second, the smoother your video will look. Therefore, 30 frames per second will result in a smoother look than 24 or 25 frames per second. Because professional movies use a frame rate of 24 frames per second, this look is often perceived as cinematic. 25 frames per second is a PAL frame rate that is intended to reduce flickering and artificial light in the PAL region, which includes most countries outside the US and Canada. A 360 camera like the X3 is most often used to capture action or special experiences in nature. It is less about achieving a cinematic result. Rather, you want to create an immersive look. And in my opinion, this works better with the somewhat smoother frame rate of 30 frames per second. I would therefore only deviate from the standard settings of 5.7K 30 in the following cases. Slow motion, if you are creating a larger project with 24-25 frames per second and want to use your 360 clip for this, and possibly in low light. In other words, in poor lighting conditions. In low light, and that includes shooting indoors in artificial light, a frame rate of 24 or 25 frames per second is advantageous, because it allows you to capture a bit more light, even though I have to admit that the difference to 30 frames per second is rather small. But let's talk about slow motion. For slow motion shots, you have to reduce the resolution on the X3. In 4K, you can shoot at up to 60 frames per second. This allows for a slow motion recording of up to 40%. In 3K, even 100 frames per second are available, and thus a slow motion recording of up to 24%. But beware, slow motion recordings can sometimes look very cool, but unfortunately on the X3 they lead to significantly poorer image quality. And that's even if at first glance the difference between 5.7K and 4K doesn't seem that huge. But resolution is not the only factor for image quality, so only use a frame rate of 60 or 100 frames per second if you're confident you'll get an interesting slow motion shot. Swiping to the left opens the advanced settings menu. Here you can make changes in automatic mode, or you can set exposure completely manually. Manual is selected when you want to set exposure yourself. In automatic mode, the camera will continue to try to set exposure so that the shot is as well exposed as possible. But even in automatic mode, you can make some changes. Let's start on the left. Here you can set the color profile. You have the choice between standard, lock and vivid. The difference between standard and vivid is mainly that the vivid color profile contains much more saturation. Standard leads to a more natural look. For this reason, I would really only recommend Vivid if you like the strong saturation and want to share your clips right away and aren't interested in editing the colors yourself. If you're still planning on grading the colors of your shots yourself, then I can definitely recommend shooting in lock with the X3. Actually, I'm not a big fan of lock color profiles on these consumer cameras, but I have to admit that the lock profile on the X3 works well. Especially in the highlights, you definitely get more detail with the lock profile than with standard or Vivid. You can see it relatively well in these shots here. That means you can improve the dynamic range of your shots with lock. However, in situations where there is little contrast, for example when skiing on a cloudy day, I would not use lock. Right next to the color profile, you can set the white balance. The white balance determines whether your image has a warm or a cool tone, but white should always look white and not yellow or blue. Setting the white balance manually requires some experience. I find that the camera's automatic white balance works well overall, so I usually leave it set to auto. A manual setting might be especially useful if you plan to take longer shots in consistent lighting conditions. The manual setting prevents the camera from changing the white balance during the shot for no real reason, which in the worst case could ruin your shot. For example, on a sunny day outdoors, a white balance of 5500 is recommended. With EV or exposure value, you can set whether the camera should expose the shot a little darker or brighter. Depending on the situation, it can be useful to use a slightly negative value. This way you protect details in the very bright areas of the image. Burnt out highlights cannot be saved, but if a shot is a bit too dark, it is very easy to brighten it up in post. I therefore set EV to -0.5. And here on the far right, there is still a possibility that the two sensors of the X3 use separate exposure settings. As mentioned earlier, it could be that the lighting situation is difficult. On one side it could be very bright, on the other very dark. Extreme example, you are filming from a dark room to the outside. Then it might make sense for the two cameras of the X3 to use separate exposure settings. And with that we've discussed all the settings in automatic mode. If you set exposure to manual, you get two more settings, the ISO value and the shutter speed. The shutter speed determines how long the single frame of the shot is exposed. The longer, the brighter the image will be. A lower shutter speed therefore leads to a brighter image. I would only ever set the shutter speed manually in one case. Low light. The X3 has excellent electronic stabilization. However, this requires very sharp images. And for sharp images, the camera needs a very short exposure time. This works well with the automatic mode if you are filming outdoors in daylight. If on the other hand there is little light, and this is already the case when you shoot indoors, then the automatic will set the shutter speed so that more light comes in. But if the shutter speed is too long, this can lead to smerry and bad shots. In low light conditions, I would recommend a frame rate of 24 frames per second and a shutter speed of 1/50th. This is basically a good ratio. Note, however, that at a shutter speed of 1/50th, the stabilization will not work as well as usual. You have to pay more attention to a stable handling of the camera. In good lighting conditions, however, I leave the shutter speed set to auto. The ISO value, on the other hand, determines how sensitively the camera reacts to the incident light. The higher the ISO value, the brighter the image will be. Unfortunately, a high ISO value leads to image noise and unsightly artifacts. For good image quality, the ISO value should therefore be as low as possible. In good lighting conditions, that is in the sun during the day, you can easily fix this value at 100. This guarantees optimal image quality. In low light, on the other hand, an ISO value of 100 leads to a somewhat too dark image. Here you can manually increase it as much as necessary. You should know that the image looks quite good up to an ISO value of 400. Above an ISO value of 800, the image quality drops rapidly. I would therefore only use 800 if there is really no other way. For optimal image quality, fix the ISO value at 100 in sunlight and daylight. In low light, set the ISO value manually so that the image is just bright enough. 800 should be the limit. If the lighting conditions could change during the recording, you can also fix a maximum ISO value here on the far left. For example, 800 max or 400 max. The camera will then adjust the ISO values required, but will not exceed the maximum value. And there are two more settings that I would like to discuss with you today. To do this, you have to open the main menu and tap on the settings icon. In this menu, two more settings are important for us. The first is the setting for the video bitrate. This should be set to high. This is the only way to get the best possible image quality. I can only recommend standard if you really want to save storage space. And just below you will find the setting for video sharpness. Your X3 produces a relatively sharp image. However, a large part of this sharpness is artificially created by the camera by increasing the contrast at the edges. This is what is known as digital sharpness. This makes the image look somewhat artificial. It does not look professional, and above all, you can hardly remove the sharpness later. Therefore, if you plan to edit your shots, I would recommend the sharpness of low. You can then add some sharpness in your editing software if the image looks too soft. But even if you don't want to edit your shots, I would reduce the sharpness to medium. Okay, that was a lot of information. Let's summarize the most important statements. Only use single lens mode if you don't want to reframe your shot or if the lighting conditions are very uneven. I would use 5.7K 30 as the default setting in most cases. In the capture settings, I would make the following changes. Color, standard or log if you are editing your shot. EV to -0.5. In low light, expose manually and use a shutter of 1/50th and an ISO of 400 or 800 maximum. You should always reduce the sharpness to medium, and if you edit your clips, even to low. If you're interested in how the X3 compares to the One RS or the 1" 360 or even the GoPro Max, take a look at my corresponding videos. You can find links in the video description. And give me a like as feedback if the video was interesting for you. There will be more tutorials on the X3, so stay tuned and see you next time.